Prior to 1860, private money had begun to have great influence, but America and Western civilization were still undergoing changes from the feudal system of the 18th, 17th, 16th, 15th century and Middle Ages. It took many generations for the class distinctions of birth, of royalty, of church and state to finally eradicate themselves under the organic pressures of rights, liberty, and freedom, also known as capitalism. Because money's value is based on what you can convert it into, and products, service, and labor are converted into money when they are produced in excess of what the producer needs for his own personal needs, money becomes production, production becomes money, and money attains its value by what people who produce can convert it into quickly and easily. Welcome back to the Moneyball Method Podcast. This is Mark Shupe, the author of the Moneyball Method, a Middle-Class Manifesto for Objective Investing. And what I'd like to do today is continue my conversation about the history of money, technological advancements, and capital formation. And as you may recall, if you tuned in last week, I discussed the last 30 years of the 19th century. In other words, 1870 through 1900. And I'd like to continue to go back in history, a little bit of a trip down memory lane for those of you that were alive 150 years ago, and cover the period between 1800 and 1870. But this time I'm going to reverse gears and put it in reverse. And I'm going to walk backwards, starting with the decade of the 1860s. And the reason is twofold. In the 1860s, that was approximately the year, the time frame in which private capital really started to assert itself as the funding source for private investment, for technological advancement. Prior to 1860, private money had begun to have great influence, but America and Western civilization were still undergoing changes from the feudal system of the 18th, 17th, 16th, 15th century and Middle Ages. It took many generations for the class distinctions of birth, of royalty, of church and state to finally eradicate themselves under the organic pressures of rights, liberty, and freedom, also known as capitalism. And I'm going to begin by mentioning a banker that all of you have heard of. Some of you have heard of J.P. Morgan in negative terms, others in very positive terms. But J.P. Morgan was a pivotal figure in the late 19th century, 1800s, and it was 1860 that private capital markets came into their own. The telephone and Edison's electrical system were essentially venture funded by wealthy individuals. In fact, J.P. Morgan was so enthusiastic about electric light that he had his mansion wired as a demonstration project. And German industrial firms funded the internal combustion engine as a commercial bet, not as a scientific experiment. But the second industrialist that changed our lives forever and for the better that I'd like to mention was Harry Bessemer, and in particular, the Bessemer steel manufacturing and fabrication process. The first commercial production began in Sheffield, England in 1858, but internationally, a 20% share in the Bessemer patent was purchased for use in Sweden and Norway in 1857. Bessemer had applied for a patent in 1856. And then Alexander Holly of the United States visited Bessemer in 1863 and purchased the United States rights to the Bessemer process on behalf of a consortium of private investors. That is when they began setting up a steel mill in Troy, New York in 1865. However, railroad money was decisive in the development of steel. The Troy factory had attracted the attention of the Pennsylvania Railroad, which wanted to use the new process to manufacture steel rail. Carnegie Steel was able to reduce the cost of steel rails from $100 per ton to $50 per ton between 1873 and 1875. And Carnegie was setting rails for only $18 a ton by the 1890s. For Bessemer, it started out with his own capital and licensing fees, and then private investment from foreign partners, and then investment companies and private industrial capital for the vertical integration of their companies. The next major development I'd like to discuss is photography. Louis Daguerre of France applied for a patent in 1839 on light-sensitive properties of silver salts for the process known as daguerreotype. He exposed a thin silver-plated copper sheet to iodine crystals and produced a coating of light-sensitive silver iodide on the surface. By 1839, Daguerre was ready to go public. At a joint meeting of the French Academy of Sciences, Daguerre explained and demonstrated the process to the Academy's secretary, who proved to be an invaluable advocate. The French government then acquired the rights in exchange for lifetime pensions and presented the daguerreotype process free as a gift to the world. Remember, this is prior to 1860. Western civilization was still emerging from the distinctions of economy and birth of the feudal system. Governments were necessary at that time to fund major inventions of this type. Prior to that, 1837, the telegraph was patented by two sets of investors and inventors in the same year, Samuel Morse in the United States and Cook and Wheatstone in the UK. Patents were filed in the US and UK, and both projects were privately funded partnerships. In May 1845, Morse formed the Magnetic Telegraph Company to build telegraph lines from New York City toward Philadelphia, Boston, Buffalo, New York, and the Mississippi River. In 1841, Morse had received a federal appropriation of $30,000 from the U.S. government, that is, that proved the technology, but after the private enterprise took over, and in the UK, Cook and Wheatstone never received direct government funding. Their capital came from railways with a clear commercial need for signaling, which is far more efficient path. So telegraph was the exception to government funding, with the exception of the grant that received by the federal government by Samuel Morse. But as I've mentioned a couple of times already, railroads were instrumental. In fact, it is the partnerships between communication, steel, and railroads that were essential, and that you may recall if you were a reader of Ayn Rand's fiction in Atlas Shrugged. These were key partnerships. These were codependent investors that needed each other based on contracts and trust. In this case, it was Richard Trevithick and George Stephenson of the United Kingdom. Trevithick ran the first steam locomotive on iron rails by pulling ore in 1804 Wales. Then George Stephenson's rocket won Rail Hill trials in 1829, proving a steam locomotive could reliably haul passengers faster than a horse. This was the moment investors took notice. The United States immediately followed. The Baltimore and Ohio and the South Carolina Canal and Railroad began steam operations in 1830. Notice the steam engine is now an intricate part of these partnerships, and that had been developed in the previous century in the United Kingdom during the late 1700s. But by the 1840s and 50s, there was great railroad speculation on both sides of the Atlantic. It consumed enormous amounts of capital, iron, and labor. Governments offered land grants, entrepreneurs raced to connect cities, and by the time Vanderbilt had consolidated his rail empire in the 1860s, the locomotive industry was arguably the largest and most complex manufacturing sector in the world. Ultimately, the United States Congress handed the transcontinental railroad builders tens of millions of acres of public land to collateralize their bonds, to finance the construction. And this was a subsidy that dwarfed anything that private investors had put in. And I'd like to continue by switching from heavy industry to art. Who was the world's first great software pioneer and rock star? I would argue that that was Ludwig von Beethoven. Beethoven was actively negotiating with publishers to sell his works around 1800, and he was entrepreneurial about this, sometimes selling the same work to multiple publishers in different countries simultaneously. Copyright laws at the time had not caught up to Beethoven. And then in 1809, a group of Viennese patrons arranged an annuity for him. But this was structured to keep him in Vienna rather than the traditional model of a composer serving a household. It was not traditional patronage, and he continued to sell his compositions independently. In effect, sheet music was the software. And Beethoven gave his last performance several years later in Vienna, Austria, to an audience of common folk. Aristocrats and royal patrons were not invited, to premiere his Ninth Symphony as a guest conductor, because he could not hear the huge standing ovation that his composition had received by the audience behind him until he turned around to see it. World's first great rock star. But truly, the 19th century began where it ended, with economics and finance, with money and capital. None of this is possible. The capital to fund the railroads, the steel, the photography, the government funding is only possible if wealth has been created by independent minds who are producing and creating wealth. Nature of this, known as economic science, was discovered by Jean-Baptiste Say and written in his treatise of 1803. It starts with Say's law of markets. The principle is that supply creates its own demand, and that is the cornerstone of all sound economic theory. Production creates the income necessary to buy anything, and Say argued that overproduction is impossible in the long run because every act of production creates purchasing power equal to the value of the goods produced. This is a fundamental principle of the Moneyball Method. The only money supply that matters is money in production. The second aspect of Say's law is that he emphasized that value derives from utility, not labor. The capacity of a good or service to satisfy human wants, rather than purely from labor, as classical economists such as Ricardo had argued. And this tells me and tells us that money is production. Production is money. Money's value is determined by what you can exchange it for. Money has no intrinsic value unless it's gold and you can turn it into jewelry or other shiny objects. Because money's value is based on what you can convert it into, and products, service, and labor are converted into money when they are produced in excess of what the producer needs for his own personal needs. Money becomes production, production becomes money, and money attains its value by what people who produce can convert it into quickly and easily. And in addition to that, it was Jean-Baptiste Say that gave the term entrepreneur the meaning that we understand today, starting with Ludwig van Beethoven. Say gave the entrepreneurial a central, distinct role in economic life. Entrepreneurs are the organizers and they're risk takers who combine all factors of production. This takes talent. This takes mental focus. This takes time. This takes risk capital. Say is credited with coining the term for economic use. That was a significant conceptual advance beyond Adam Smith's treatment of the butcher, the baker, and the brewer. And I would like to conclude my remarks by saying that it is with a healthy respect of money that must be created before it can be spent or invested, that we become entrepreneurs ourselves and can then invest in the minds and in the ventures and in the enterprises that actually create wealth. The wealth-driving energies and enterprises of railroads, steel, photography, and electricity, everything that we take for granted today, starts with the money and the creation process. Thank you for joining me today. See you next week when we talk about the 18th century. Have a great day.